right, so I'm Bob Anderson. I work at Mentor Graphics, recently acquired by Siemens. So I really hope that we keep the much cooler name Mentor. So we'll see what happens there. We're down in Wilsonville, and it's a global company. So we, prior to the acquisition, had about 80 offices. I think that's several hundred now. And we went from about 6,000 employees to being part of a group that has somewhere near 20,000, but a larger company that has about 450,000 employees. So our scope is changing pretty rapidly. And Siemens is a big Microsoft shop, so SharePoint is a huge part of their normal model. So our visibility just jumped up. So that's good in a lot of ways. All right, let's dig into this thing. All right, so as I already mentioned, well, first of all, I think that these groups are best when it's just about knowledge sharing. Just one professional sharing lessons learned with another. It's not about, I'm not selling anything. You know, I'm just, this is how I do it, and there's always 100 ways to do things. So I guess part of this is I want you all to feel like this is an official invitation. If you want to present, please, like, come to these groups. Just, it doesn't even have to be super formal. Just show us what you're working on, and we'll talk about it. So open invitation, present. Like I already said, I have about 120 slides in this deck. Don't try to memorize it. We'll just cruise through it. A lot of these will just rapid fire, just real fast. Feel free to stop me if you if like something didn't make sense or you want to talk a little bit more about a certain concept. The idea was if I just rapid fire, start out really simple, and get to the more complex, it'll just sort of inspire ideas. This is my email address. You can email me to get a copy of this. Joe also, like I said, has a copy. If you do email me, put peacebug : at the beginning. I get a lot of spam, so that way I at least know where you're coming from, and I don't just send you straight to the recycle bin.
And I'll be sending out the slides through meetup.com, so make sure you're registered on meetup.com.
That's right. So that was another thing we found out earlier. Is the meetup.com is where we need to register for this group, and that's where a lot of that communication's coming from. So be sure to check that out. All right. So I thought this was funny, the IKEA job interview, but I feel like PowerShell is a lot like that. Everyone knows about PowerShell, but there's really no good resource that's like the definitive place to go, because there's so many different ways to approach it. So. The thing is, if web-based applications, and SharePoint in particular, are still considered magic like they used to be, then PowerShell is the super secret wisdom that only the initiated know about. So this is one of those times. All right, so here's the agenda. The first thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps. Because this is an on-premise presentation, we're talking about DevOps. So I'm going to talk a little bit, real simple, why would I use PowerShell? Then the basics of writing and running a PowerShell script. And we're going to start in with some really basic concepts. We're going to get into some sort of generic non-SharePointy stuff. Then we're going to start talking about just SharePoint. And we're going to get into some real-world examples. And then if you can hang on till the very end, I've got some of that super secret ancient wisdom. I'm going to share some secrets with you. So first, I want to talk about DevOps. By the way, if you haven't heard of or read it, I brought a copy of it. You can't have it, it's mine. The Phoenix Project, Portland author, fantastic read. DevOps is essentially about the relationship between development and IT operations. These have been separate groups usually in the past, and so this idea of DevOps is about changing and improving the relationship between those practices in a constantly improving way. And the bottom line is, if you have an on-premise SharePoint environment, even if that on-premise is installed virtually, like in Azure or AWS, you still have servers. If you're maintaining servers, then you understand that there's a difference between developing a SharePoint page and managing a server. They're not necessarily the same skill sets. So having that relationship between those skill sets is critical. So there's 3 ways of DevOps, and that's what this book is about. And the first way is the one that everybody seems to know about, and that's where IT takes some requirements, we develop those in some environment, and then we move that into production, and now that thing has become a service that now is in operations mode. We're maintaining this service. So that's generally what we do in IT. But so the first way is about emphasizing the performance of the entire system. So we're always thinking about how the whole system is flowing as opposed to any one particular app or tool or silo. That's the first way. The second way is about intentionally and strategically creating feedback loops. So this is about monitoring, it's about documentation, and it's about constantly trying to shorten and amplify those feedback loops. By constantly improving the complete chain, the whole thing is constantly becoming better and less error prone. So the second way is about creating feedback loops intentionally. And today we're going to talk about how to use PowerShell to do that. So the third way is about creating an environment. So we're enabling continuous learning. So a healthy DevOps environment fosters really two things. One is continual experimentation and risk taking, and then also understanding that repetition and practice are the prereqs to mastery. So this is about encouraging constant learning, experimentation, rewarding risk taking. We still have some people that we work with where there'll be some mission critical production application that they're just afraid to touch it. Like, we don't want to update it, we don't want to do anything because we're going to break it, and if we break it, babies die. So the problem with that is, what do you do when it breaks if nobody knows how to fix it? So get it into a QA environment and break that sucker, and then fix it, and then practice it, do it again. And that's what the third way is about, encouraging that type of behavior so that we learn. So we think about these things a lot these days. All right, so enough preaching, we'll get to the good stuff. Why use PowerShell? So with very few exceptions, you could do just about anything that you would need to do with SharePoint via some type of UI, either central admin or some type of server management interface. You can point and click your way through just about anything. So why would you want to use PowerShell for SharePoint? Well, for one reason, it's repeatable consistency. You can make a change, then you can save that file and make the exact same change somewhere else. So you can be absolutely sure that you are making the exact same change repeatedly. Another thing is knowledge growth. So maybe you solved a problem last week, or it took you a week to solve a problem, and the result of that was a PowerShell script that you saved. Now, week, 2 weeks, a month later, you've got a new problem, and that saved PowerShell script is the starting point, and you're able to just pick that up and run with it. You don't have to redo all that work or remember what it was because you saved your script. So this is where I first got introduced to PowerShell, was the idea of mass change. So somebody comes and says, hey, I've got 10,000 sites, and I need to add a column to a library on all of those sites. Would you mind clicking through all of them and adding a column? No, I would not want to do that. But it's really easy to do in PowerShell. So anything involving mass change, you got to loop through sites, libraries, items, and make any kind of change in mass. PowerShell is your tool. So monitoring. So PowerShell is open source. It can be triggered by a Windows scheduled task. It's far easier to maintain that kind of a structure than it is to deploy a compiled timer job. It's far easier than a farm solution. Just run a PowerShell script as a Windows scheduled task. I'm going to show some examples of that today. So reality check, there are some things that you have to use PowerShell for. Sometimes, like if you're making a change to like your search service app, there's a few other areas, maybe setting up the Office web apps where you have to use PowerShell. So you might as well just embrace it altogether. It's a really healthy thing to do. All right, so basics of writing and running PowerShell code. So there's this thing called the ISE, stands for Integrated Scripting Environment. This installs in Windows Server as a feature. So just go to Add Features, and it's in the PowerShell category. Just check that box and run through the wizard. This is the official way to run PowerShell, and this is incidentally how I do PowerShell. You can also use Visual Studio Code, and if anyone's come to my talk about REST APIs, you know that I love Visual Studio Code. This is my UI of choice for writing client-side code. But even though it can do PowerShell, and there's a pretty extensive community of people supporting doing PowerShell in this, I am reluctant to install any kind of development tool on a production server at all. So you can use Visual Studio Code for this. There are also many other IDEs for PowerShell. But the same thing. I mean, just don't. It's just not smart to be installing developer tools on a production server. It opens holes. It installs libraries that you don't necessarily need or want to have to protect. So it's just too risky. So for me, I just stick with the ISE. The basics are, and all of them kind of work the same way. It's a scripting environment, and you can run your whole script, or you can just highlight a certain section and run just that. That's what this slide is showing. All right, so some basic concepts. First of all, I think a lot of people get hung up with PowerShell because they think of it as just a collection of commands. Like, I have this command and I'm gonna run it and it does this thing. So I'm encouraging you to think of PowerShell as a scripting language. You're not just running one command, you're writing a script. So in most cases, in my opinion, a longer, more readable script is better than a super short script. You may be able to do the whole thing in one line, but if you can't understand it, then what's the point? And there's really three different types of PowerShell when we're talking about SharePoint. There's on-premise PowerShell, where you're running it on a server in a SharePoint farm. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And most of my experience is in that area. There's this thing called PowerShell remoting, where you have some other server or some machine somewhere that's running PowerShell that's reaching out to another machine or a server farm and running it from there. That's different, and it uses this thing called invoke request, where you're basically sending commands to it. You might also do that to administer servers and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit, but not a whole lot. SharePoint Online has its own PowerShell structure. Almost everything that we're going to show today you can do with SharePoint Online, but the syntax is slightly different. All the commands are prefixed with SPO. So it's just a different syntax, but for the most part, almost every example that we show could be tweaked slightly to work with SharePoint Online. All right, so PowerShell has this thing called a snap-in. Does anyone use Perl? Is anyone familiar with the old Perl? No? Okay. So never mind then. So okay, so you have this module that defines all the commands, and there's one for SharePoint. So it installs with SharePoint. So if you're on a SharePoint server, it's already installed. But to load all the commands that you would need for SharePoint, you have to run this get ps snap-in command, and you tell it that you want to load in the SharePoint module. So basic stuff. Comments in your script. You can have a single line comment by putting the hash mark and then write a comment. You can have multiple lines of comments using this syntax. I encourage people to write as much comments as you can. Think of it as you're leaving notes to your future self or maybe your coworkers. There have been so many times where I've written something, I come back 6 months later and I didn't have any comments. I'm looking at it like, what the heck was I thinking? So just literally write what the heck I'm thinking in comments in your script. It's not like those extra lines are going to take up disk space, right? It's just comments to yourself. All right, so in the PowerShell ISE, and we're going to see this a little bit more, you have a pane where you're writing the code and executing it, and then the results are shown up over here in this console. You can use colors, and I tend to do this a bunch, where I have my output in different colors, and sometimes there's a lot of logical reason for that. So that's something that you can look at. I also use this no new line a lot. So that's this bottom line. So sometimes you want to just keep adding to the same line with separate right host statements. I actually have the ISE open. I was going to show you this. So here's the ISE. I'm going to run this script. This is the other way to do multiple lines, where you can have a variable that is prefixed with an @ sign at both ends, and then you can put a whole bunch of text in the middle. It's just a big string. So that's kind of fun. This is a little trick. I have a whole slide about this one later, but I'm saying I want to write this string 20 times. So you get I do this a bunch with dashes in my output. So you can also call that clear host up at the top, so it's going to clear everything on this side of the screen. So if maybe I have a script that I know it's going to run for 4 hours, and I'm constantly looping through something. As I loop through each site or list or whatever I'm doing, clear the host, write to the screen which one I'm on. I'm on 50 of 200, and just write it out to the host.
Can I add something to it?
Sure.
So usually when I do like a script, I make it available to the other guys so that they can just right click and run it.
Yeah.
So when they right click and run it, it just runs the script and close down the window. So what I do is at the end, after this last write host, I just put like a read host. So it waits for some key to be pressed.
Oh, okay.
So that the window will stay open until they just press some.
That's a good tip. So then you run the whole thing as this self-contained little,
Yeah, and
little
they just
program.
right click and run it, and the window will be
It
there.
opens it
with
up.
Any message or, yeah.
That's good. All right, so, oh, and you saw that text example. I use this a bunch. It's just this website. You can type in this text. This guy's got like a couple of hundred fonts that'll spit out ASCII. So just a little fun trick. I use that for code comments as well. So it's like a big highlight at the top of a function or something. All right, so the startup module. I told you that we have to load that snap in. So what I do is I have a startup.ps1, and you can load any script. So you could save your file as a PS1 file, and then you can call this import module, and then just refer to the path to your file, and it's as if that file was at the top of your script. So it will execute linearly from top to bottom, but it's as if you copied and pasted that other script right there. So I'll have a separate file that has all the things that I want every script to have. So here's that script. First thing it does is clear the host screen. Then I'm purging any variables that might still be there that are disposable. Just looks to see if there are any and kills them if they are. I set up some colors in my ISE because I'm just weird that way. And then I have, this is where it's loading the snap-in. So it just checks to see, is it already loaded? And if not, load it, because it takes 2 or 3 seconds to load, so I don't want to load it every time. It loads that, and then it writes to the screen the current username that's running the script, and then a current date timestamp. So every script sort of starts this way. All right, so a little bit about memory management. So every script, you don't have to do this, it's just sort of responsible as a systems administrator. You can start and stop a memory assignment space. And so this is actually a SharePoint thing, start SP assignment. And so this will hold on in memory to list objects or SP site objects or any kind of SharePoint objects will get saved in this space. And then you can just kill it when you're done. So anything that might have been left open, you could just kill it. So this would global means global to the server where you're running this. But you can also specify a custom variable name that it's the same thing, but it's going to have, this is your sort of a custom space to hold on to it. So if you're in a server environment where more than one person might be on that same server running PowerShell, it's best to do it this way, where your script has some custom named variable, and all of the memory associated with all the objects in your script are going to be in that space, and then you can kill the whole thing when you're done.
Question.
Yeah.
I never used it. Is it?
You don't have to. It's just good hygiene. And in fact, if when you close your ISE window, you're effectively letting go of those objects as well. But I have a lot of stuff that I run automatically, so I don't want to risk it sort of exploding into using up all my memory on that server. It's just good hygiene. But you don't have to. It won't yell at you if you don't. So here's a basic template. For me, this is a basic template of how each script starts. I have the startup module imported. I put my name, the date, a summary of what the script is, and then I start and stop a memory space, and then everything I'm going to do is going to be in there. All right, so PowerShell variables. So variables in PowerShell start with a $, all of them. And PowerShell's pretty good at telling the difference between a string and a number. You don't have to declare that it's a string or an integer. There are times where you do have to, particularly if it's like an object that's not just a normal string or a number. And sometimes you'll want to force it. If you're doing math or something like that, you want to make sure that it's an integer. You can declare it this way. But for the most part, PowerShell will figure it out. All right, so I want to talk about these two special characters, the pipe and the backtick. For some reason, this one hung me up for a while. It took me a couple years to really sort of soak in the pipe. But it's really simple once you figure out what it's doing. It basically, you're saying, here's a command, and whatever outputs from that command, I'm going to send that output into another command. And then you can daisy chain these things together as long as you want. But if you can imagine that this command's going to have an output, and whatever that output is, I'm just going to shove it over to this next command. That's really all that you're doing. So here's an example of something that's really complicated and really inefficient and you shouldn't do, but just to sort of make the point. I'm starting with a string that's a URL, and I'm going to pipe that into a get spweb command, so it's going to get that web, and then so it's returning an spweb object, which I pipe into a for each loop. It gives me this $_, which, by the way, whatever this output is that pipes in, this is the variable name that it's going to show up as. So I get my spweb object and I pipe it into a for each loop, and I'm going to loop through all the lists, and then I'm going to pipe that into a where objects, and now $_ equals whatever list I'm currently on in the loop, and I'm looking at its name, and I'm looking for one that equals this list name, and then I'm going to pipe that into a for each of all the items in the list. So now $_ is a list, and I'm looping through its items, which I'm piping to a where object where it says where that item has a name that's like this item name. Did that make sense? Question.
Yeah, so how do you know if, like the first line, the second line, the third line, how do you know it's compatible? What if the list doesn't have a name? What kind of error does it show you?
So that's a really good question, and that's one of the reasons I don't like to do it this way. I like to break this whole thing out and just and treat it as like I would in a programming language, and I'm going to show that here in a bit. But you don't really know, especially in these one-liners here. Also, we'll talk about this a little bit more later when we talk about querying lists. But this is going to get the entire spweb and return the whole thing as one object. And then this is going to return all of the lists, all of them, all of it. And then this is going to return all of the items in that list, all of it, and then just to get to one item. So this is a super intense query just to get to one item. So not efficient. The most common use of the pipe, at least for me, is here I'm going to set a variable equal to the web. So that's the same query, but now I have this variable I can work with. And then maybe I want to loop through the lists. And I want to take the lists and pipe that into saying I just want the name of lists, and I'm going to pipe that into a command that's going to sort that by name. So to me, this is the real functional use of the pipe. This is going to return something, and then I'm just going to filter and sort it. I'm not necessarily trying to do a lot of functionality with the pipe. You could, though. There was this big sort of thing going on for a while where people were really trying to get this whole script down into one line if they could, and it just I don't know. I feel like it's counterproductive. All right, so here's another use of the pipe that is super valuable. There's this function called getMember. You can shorten it with GM. It does the same thing. So this is literally going to output every method, every property, and if there is any events associated with this variable or object of whatever it is, and it will show you everything that you could do with it. I'm going to actually show you that example live too. All right, so first of all, all right, so there's this PSISE is a built-in variable that actually references your current session. So if I said PSISE and I'm going to pipe that into getMember, it's going to show me all of the methods and properties that are associated with that object. So I know that I can do stuff with it. So and there's one in here, .options. So let's look at that. So here's all the options that I could access in PowerShell that are associated with the PowerShell ISE. So this is how I'm setting background color and doing all sort of console stuff in the ISE. And I'm just using this as an example because we've loaded it in. But here's another one that's information about the file that's the script file that I'm working with. So I can see here's all the methods and properties that I can work with. So a lot of the stuff that that I've done over the years has just been, let me just pick this object apart and let me see what methods and properties I have to work with and start calling them and just see what I can do. So imagine if you're like changing settings on a list or a column or anything. All right, let's flip back over here. Okay, so the backtick. Backtick is like word wrap in SharePoint. So you can put a backtick at the end of the line, and that's that little funky key that's next to the 1 on your keyboard. And then you can break the line, and then PowerShell will treat it all as the same line. So if you got like a really long string and you want to break it so that you can have a readable area in your code, you can break that line. Even right in the middle of anything. Okay, so often these are used together. So backtick at the end, pipe at the beginning. Here's a cheesy real-world example of where I actually would use the pipe. In this case, I'm getting a reference to a specific server, and I'm getting every SharePoint service instance that's running on that server, and then I'm looking for specific ones that have those strings in their name. So this is returning to me any service running on that server that has Excel, PowerPoint, or Word in the service name. All right, operators in PowerShell. Equal is an operator that means that you're setting a variable equal to something. It's not the same thing as I'm comparing, is this variable equal to something? If you're comparing something, you're using one of these type operators. If the equal sign is used to set a variable. That confused me for a while too. And this is not a complete list. There's actually a lot of these out there, and it's pretty easy to find if you search. But the main thing I guess I wanted you to walk away from with this is that equal versus dash EQ. So it's setting a value, comparing a value. All right, functions in PowerShell. All right, so we define a function with the word function, give it a name, curly bracket, and a closed curly bracket. Then we can have parameters, which are values that are coming into the function when it gets executed. In this case, I have a parameter called web. And then we call a function by, here's the function name, then a space, and then the value. So in this case, I'm passing in an SP web object. So I'm calling the function, and I'm passing into it a reference to get SP web with a URL. So that's a pretty basic function, but it points out something that's called recursion. So this function actually has a call to itself. So down here I'm calling the function, I'm passing it a web, and then inside the function I'm going to loop through all of the subsites of that web, and then for each of those subsites I'm calling the same function. So this method is called recursion, so this is a recursive function. Oh, question.
So when you instantiate a variable like that within a function, is that the value of that variable is only available within that function as opposed to within some other function or the main code?
It is only available within that function. And actually I have another example I'm going to show you later, but you can do like a local memory space assignment even just inside the function so that all the variables inside that function will stay there, and then I kill it at the end. I often do that because I don't want to collide with a really common name that might be used somewhere else in the script.
And then the inverse of that, if you have variables declared in the main code, are those variables available in the function?
In that case, yes. But there's another case where you can have global variables, and actually show that a little bit more when I have error handling, so that you can define it globally and then have other functions and sub-functions writing to those variables. But yeah, the scoping of variables sometimes can get tricky.
Yeah.
And notice.
What if you have a variable within a function, but you pass it to another function? How does that work?
You can return it.
Yeah, you could return it. Actually, I'm going to show that on the next slide. But one thing, so just to keep these short for the slides, I'm not specifying that this is an SP web object, and I'm not doing any kind of error checking to make sure that it actually is an SP web. But that's something you probably want to do. So in this function, I'm showing you can return a value. So I'm passing into it some numbers, and I'm giving them these variable names, but then I'm doing something with it and then returning the result. So now I have a variable equals the results of that function call. I have one that I'll show later where it's a function that checks to see if a folder exists in a library, and if it exists, it returns it. If it doesn't exist, it creates it and then returns it. So either way, I can say folder equals this function. So I mentioned that there's always a lot of ways to do the same thing. So the previous slide showed that params at the top here. This does the same thing, where I'm setting a variable equal to, there's this, it's an array called args, or stands for arguments. So whatever the first argument is, I'm going to set it to x. And also in this case, I'm saying return value equals x plus y, and then I return the return value. So as opposed to return x plus y, because this gives me space to do some error checking and so forth, and I can have a default return value even if this blows up or doesn't work. So there's some tricks you could do that way too. All right, so let's talk about some non-SharePoint T. Oh no, we're doing error handling first. Here we go. All right, so this line enables this thing called try catch finally. And silently continue means that when you get an error occurs, don't just stop and report it to the screen. I want to keep going. So what I do is you try, and then you do some stuff, and if an error happens, you hit this catch. And then you can do some stuff in here, and then there's the finally block, and the finally block gets executed regardless of whether there was any errors or not. Incidentally, if you could actually have multiple catch statements that would catch a specific exception, but I'm trying to keep this simple and just say one, try it. If there's an error, you're going to get here, and then this will happen no matter what. So what I like to do is have one error handle function, and then in all the places I have try catch in my code, it's just a one-liner where I'm calling the error handle function. So, and here's, I mentioned there's global variables. So I define these global variables somewhere outside this function, and then I'm incrementing, an error count. I'm updating a message. I'm writing something out to the console. But all of this stuff is only in one place, and once that's defined, I just call it inside my catch statement. All right, now we're going to do some non-SharePoint. All right. So here's that trick with the little, I'm going to write this character 50 times. You can do it with a whole string. I actually use that a bunch, and it's one of those simple little things where you just don't think about it, but once you know, you know. All right, working with CSV. So you've got a CSV file. You want to import it into your PowerShell script so that you can analyze it and do something with CSV. It's literally just a one-liner. I've got a variable name, and it's equal to import CSV and give it the path. You can specify a delimiter. The default is the comma, but if your file is delimited with something else, you just tell it what character it's delimited by. And then here I'm looping through the rows. So for each row in my CSV data, if you have a well-structured header row, you can even refer to it by column name as you loop through the rows. Alternately, you could refer to it by its index. So it's a zero-based index. So as I loop through, for each row, this is the first column, and this is the second column in my CSV. So that's really easy. Literally a one-liner to open a CSV file.
Do you have this for like a spreadsheet? Does it work?
I actually have an example of that too, with Excel. So what about writing CSV? Any object, any variable, pipe to export CSV and give it a path. That's it. And it's super fast. So I'm going to just pause here for a second. All right, so working with Excel, this is totally possible. In this case, I'm going to open a file. I'm going to give it a path and a file name. This Excel object is literally opening a COM object with for Excel.application. So that's what this big warning over here says. You will actually see Excel.exe if you go into Task Manager. It'll start as a process. That's really important to know because if you don't call this stuff here at the bottom, that's just going to stay running. So working with Excel can be a little bit dangerous that way because if you're not careful, you get a whole bunch of those Excel instances running and you'll eat up memory. But you can do it, and once you open it, and in this case I'm opening the Excel application, then I'm opening the specific workbook, and then I'm opening a worksheet in that workbook. And now this, if you've ever worked with VBA, looks just like VBA because it's literally the same .NET namespace. So you can use the dot cells, the dot range. Anything you can do in VBA, you can do in PowerShell. The main thing is just to remember, if you're ever working with Excel in PowerShell, make sure that it gets closed. All right, so Active Directory. Oftentimes we have to interact with Active Directory, and there's a whole module for Active Directory. This script will map a SharePoint user profile to an Active Directory user profile, and it uses email address as the key. So if I get a user, I can get to Active Directory, and now I can expose any Active Directory attributes inside my PowerShell. So we use this sometime because there's things in Active Directory that aren't picked up by the user profile sync. Maybe I want to check some attribute that isn't otherwise there. You can do that. All right, so things that you might do to administer a Windows server. There's commands built in to do all sorts of things, but this is just sort of to give you some ideas. You could literally, in a virtual environment, provision a new server, install an operating system and patches. You configure anything and everything. You can even join it to a SharePoint farm, all in PowerShell. In fact, I've had this dream of one day doing this. If you've ever wondered how Microsoft is able to deploy a CU update without their front ends going down, they literally rebuild their entire farm in PowerShell, reinstall all of the stuff, install all the patches, and then at the last minute they swap it out so the DNS is now pointing to the new farm. The whole thing is done in PowerShell. Pretty slick. So things you might do: start and stop a service, add and remove a feature, maybe do some health checky kind of stuff, maybe do some IP or DNS type configuration, some firewall stuff. You could view and manage event logs. One thing that's really common is copying log files. So you got your IS log files start to get really big, and you want to just get them off the server into some other storage. You could do all that in PowerShell. For IIS, there is a special module, IIS administration. You could do all sorts of things. Anything you could do inside the IIS UI, you could do in PowerShell. One thing I've seen people do is swap in and out a different web config. So maybe you've got a web config that's set up for better error reporting or something like that. You got to swap it in to troubleshoot. Just have a script that go into debug mode and just restart IIS. You're in business. All right. Let's see. Windows file system. So I'm get files, folders, copy, move, delete, just working with files across a network. This invoke web request will literally do like a browser request to any URL. There's also built-in ways to be able to pass authentication. So you could call an API this way. You could literally hit cnn.com if you wanted to. It's just a web request, and it will return HTML or whatever comes back from that web request. Maybe it's JSON. There's session handling, so you don't have to constantly relog in. I realize I just spelled ODBC wrong. Somehow there's a B in ODBC. So you could connect to any database, run a SQL query. The prerequisite here is that whatever ODBC driver you're using has to be installed on the server. So if you're trying to query Oracle, you got to have the Oracle driver installed on the server. But as long as it is, you literally connect to the database, execute SQL, and return your results. in PowerShell. We do a lot of, we have done a lot of, where we'll convert, somebody's got like a MySQL table and you want to convert it to a SharePoint list. There you go.
Yeah, so there's a send mail command.
A what
PowerShell.
command?
Send mail.
Oh,
So
send mail.
for-
Yeah.
for sending email using an SMTP server. So
Yeah.
if you want to check your outgoing SMTP server from SharePoint, usually.
Does it look like
yeah,
this one? Super handy.
Yeah, usually the Outlook in your organization uses another
Mhm.
like Exchange server, right? So if you want to check the SMTP server that you're using for outgoing SharePoint email, this is the best way to do
Yeah,
it.
and actually the way you're describing, you can actually use, there's a snap-in for Exchange, so you can come in that way. This is actually using SharePoint.utilities namespace, so it's going to use the outgoing email settings of your SharePoint farm. So in this case, it will look like it's coming from SharePoint,
yeah.
the email.
Yeah, if for some reason SharePoint outgoing email is not working, you can actually use the other way to check if the SMTP mail server is working properly.
Super handy. So yeah, that's true. So Exchange has a lot of modules too. Also SQL Server. We do a lot of stuff directly to SQL Server from PowerShell. Examples might be moving a database to a different drive. We had to do that recently. One got really big and we needed a separate drive on SQL just for that content database. We were able to do that without the site even going down, incidentally. Another thing too is the out-of-the-box content databases have these weird auto-growth settings that we always end up having to go back and fix. So you just enforce that, just loop through all your databases and set those settings. Maybe you want to verify your service account permissions, backup and restore. This is huge. All that can be done in PowerShell.
So, first question is that what level of permissions do you need to the SQL Server in order to be able to run PowerShell commands against?
I don't know the specific minimum level. I'm sysadmin on all of the servers, so I don't know what the minimum level would be. I would think that you obviously need at least write, but that's a good question. From a perspective of trying to give them the least amount of privilege possible, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Doesn't add SP shell admin assign the permissions of the database?
So add SP shell admin is on the content database, right? When you create a content database, and that gives you the ability to do remote PowerShell into that database, that content database. But you could still actually get to it in these other ways, connecting directly into the database. That's a good question. If you were referring to that database from outside the server farm, you would definitely need that remote ability. All right, so now talking about just SharePoint stuff. I'm just going to cruise through these really fast, so interrupt me if you see something that draws your attention. This script is going to loop through all site collections in a web app. This script is going to loop through all subsites in a collection. This one's going to loop through all lists in a subsite. This is going to loop through all items in a list. I do this one all the time. This is going to create a new item in a list. So I'm connecting to the web, connecting to the list. New item equals list.newItem. Set some column values, update the item, drop the web. This is looping through columns in a list. If you haven't already seen this, PowerShell is going to call them fields. It's an SP field. It's not a column. You want to change the URL of a site collection. It used to be that you had to create a new site collection, migrate into it, and then drop the old collection. One-liner, PowerShell. Just like that, too. Nothing changes but the URL.
Does that work for Office 365 groups?
I don't know. I haven't tried that.
We're gonna try it. We get this.
We do this all the time.
This sets the audit settings on a site collection. I like to turn all of my audit settings on. It's not a storage issue for us. And sometimes our site owners will go through and turn them off for some unknown reason. So I just enforce it. Just go back through and turn them all back on. So this is a handy little script. This is going to connect to a SharePoint site. get the content database that site's in, and loop through to see any other sites that are in that content database, and then output the URL to the site and how big it is in megabytes. This is a handy little thing here. Whenever you work with storage, it's returning bytes, but I want to see it in megabytes. So there's this little shortcut that just /1 MB will say it's going to convert bytes to megabytes, and there's a GB and a TB, the same thing. So this, I think David, you were given this example of doing this round robin thing where you're adding collections to content databases. If you wanted to be able to loop through and see, I want to see all the sites that are also in the same content database as this site, and how big are they? There you go. All right, so this is creating a new document library. So this is the list templates, a document library, connecting to the site, connecting to the web, and making sure the library doesn't already exist. And then I'm going to create it. And then over there on the side, I'm going to set some settings. So that's all stuff that you could easily, obviously, do in the browser, but it's just a script. So if you wanted to create the same library on 100 different sites and you want to make sure that they're exactly the same, there you go. Let's see, what's this one? Oh, this is breaking permission inheritance and removing permissions. So the last slide and this one were from the same use case where I wanted to create a library at the top level of every collection, and I called it site owners docs. And then I broke all the permission because I wanted only site collection admins to have access to it. So I create the library, and then I loop through it, and I delete all of the permissions. Question?
So, let's say you have a document management system that you've built. When, what are the parameters in deciding whether to utilize a scheduled PowerShell script to provide back-end management of the solution versus using a site workflow?
So pros and cons, obviously. The workflow, especially if it's an in-text, you could have a non-server administrator could get in there and tweak it, so that would be a pro leading that direction. But you have to deploy the workflow, whereas in this case, it's all just open source on the server, so it's just saving a file. That's your whole deployment. But the first question I would ask would be who has to run this thing, and who has to own it and keep it up and administrate it. And if they don't have ability to log into the server and save files, then the workflow would make a lot more sense. Here's one that's come up a few times. I want to look for a particular user, loop through all items in a list, and anytime I see that user, I want to change the created by and modified by username to something else. Got a script for that. Okay, so here's another one where we had a site where there was a whole bunch of permission groups, and they had individual people set as the owner of a permission group. And so that person went on vacation, and then other owners couldn't change or add and remove permissions to it. So this will loop through all permission groups and set the owner equal to, in this case, a group called site owners. So now the site owners are the owner of every group. What's this one doing? Oh, so somebody's left the company and you need to remove them as a site collection admin from all the sites where they might have shown up. So this is going to loop through all sites in the web app, look at the site collection administrators, and if that username exists, remove it. Here's one that we get to do all the time now that we're owned by the Germans. You got to change the password on your managed accounts. Do all that in PowerShell. This is a one-liner in 2013 anyway. All right. Oh, so timer job history. You ever had to look at the history of a running timer job and you try to do it through central admin? Brutal. It's so much easier in PowerShell. So you just say, here's the name of the job. I want to see the last 30, and just query get SP timer job, and then filter and sort your results. So much easier than click and click, 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 click. All right, so querying list items. Very, very common topic. Okay. So this is the example that you'll find all over the internet, and you'd think that this was the only way to do it, but I'll show you. So I'm going to connect to the web, connect to the list, and then I'm going to loop through every item in the list.items. And then I'm going to pipe that into some sort of query that says where the title is like something. So this works, and you can do this. And it works. It does exactly what you would think it was going to do. But as I explained at the beginning with another example, this is going to return all of the items and then filter them looking for that particular criteria. So it's a very inefficient query because it's going to return a ton of data that you might not even care about. So the alternative is to use Camel. So Camel, it's a whole sort of language around this, but it looks like XML. But I could build out a where clause. So I can connect to the site, connect to the list, just as I did before. But now I want to create a query object. Here's my query. I'm saying where, remember field is a column, where this column title has this text in it. I'm using the contains operator. So I want to find all items where title contains that string. And then when I loop through it, I'm just saying for each item that's in the query results, which is returning a smaller set of data. So you're filtering it on the server before it comes back to you. So you can actually make this even more efficient by using what's called the view fields. So same query, but now I'm saying I only care about one column. And I only care about title in this case. So not only is it going to filter out the rows that you don't care about, but it's only returning you the columns that you care about. So we have a couple of sites where we have lists that have hundreds of thousands of items. This is super efficient. You can cruise through it super fast. So I'm saying, here's my query. I only care about these fields, and then I end up with this list of items that I can loop through in PowerShell really fast. All right, so now a specific use case is creating a new site collection. So I'm going to walk through this. So this is it's a bit it's cut down to fit on slides, and I've removed almost all the comments. But I'm going to walk you through the 5 steps that we go through to create a new site collection. So step 1, defining some variables: the site name, the base URL, who the owners are. Just some just sort of basic variables about the site collection that we're going to create. I like to, I said we have a one-to-one site collection to content database. So I'll take the base URL, and it's SP 2013 underscore the base URL. So I know that database goes with that site. So that's step 1, define variables. Step 2, creating the content database. So here is a creative use of try catch. I'm going to try to get the content database with that name. That might return an error because it doesn't exist, in which case we catch it and we create it. So if this returns an error, then the database doesn't exist, so we create it. If it doesn't return an error, it's going to get here, in which case I'm just going to set the max site count equal to the current max site count plus 1. So I just made room for the site in that database. So that's step 2. Step 3, we're creating the site collection. New SP site, passing in all the variables, including the content database. Then the very next thing I do is disable the minimum download strategy, because I hate it. And then I'm setting these audit settings. Step 4, here's a good example of something that woulda, shoulda, coulda been a function. I could have just had a function and then just call it 3 times, but instead I'm doing the same thing 3 times. And I'm creating the owners, members, and visitors group. And because we're doing this in PowerShell, it doesn't do all the same stuff that central admin would do if you did it through the UI, so I have to do this manually. But I'm creating the groups, and then I'm setting the owners group to be the owner of these other groups. And then step 5 of 5, I'm enabling publishing. And then we have a top level list that's an index of all sites, so I'm adding to the index. So there it is. So it used to be half hour, 45 minutes to create a site collection. Now we could do it in 30, 40 seconds. beginning to end, database and all. All right, so the next use case is SharePoint monitoring. So this is something that was kind of born out of necessity, but has really turned into something pretty cool for us. And the basic concept is simple. I've got a PowerShell script that's being executed by a Windows scheduled task, and it's outputting to a SharePoint list. So we have a SharePoint site that only we have access to that essentially is able to summarize in list views the results of these tasks. So this is really all you need to know for setting up a scheduled task. You trigger it on whatever schedule you want, run it every hour, once a day, every minute, whatever you want to do. And the action is you're starting a program, and the program is PowerShell.exe, and the argument you're sending to it is dash-file and then the path to your script. It has to run as a user that has permission, so either as yourself or a service account, but it needs to run as a user that has both access to the server you're running it on to run PowerShell and also whatever SharePoint resources you're trying to interact with. All right, so here is a basic template for one of these scripts. So I'll have a start and an end module, and I'm going to show you what's in those. Of course, name, date, comments. So I'm calling these jobs, but basically I'm going to give the job a name and a default status. And then in here, I'm going to do whatever I do, but ultimately I'm just trying to update these two variables. And then at the very end, I'm calling this function that I'm going to show you that updates the SharePoint list that's passing in job name, message, and status. So this is the basic structure of all of these monitor scripts. So here's the startup module. I'm starting a session from memory. I'm enabling try-catch. I'm connecting to the SharePoint site that has that list and the list itself. And then these are those global variables that I'm defining that are going to keep track of anything that any sub-function might spit out. And then here's the function that updates that SharePoint list. So I'm passing into the function the job name, the message, and the status. This is an example where I'm using function-specific memory assignment. So I'm going to start and stop. There it is, stop the memory assignment at the beginning and end of my function so I can make sure I dispose of anything that's in here. So then I first do a camel query against that list to see, do I already have an item with job name as the title? And if I do, return that. And if I don't, then create it, add item. So I'm creating a new one with that name. And then either way, I get to here with job item. And I'm just updating name, message, status, last run, and then elapsed time. How long did it take to run? Update that item. That's it. All right, so this is the end. So this is the end module in these monitor scripts where I'm just disposing of those web objects. If there was any errors, I'm going to output those to the screen and then close my memory assignment. All right, so this is a real-world example. So we have this site that has a workflow on it, and for some reason that, we just haven't fixed it yet, but these workflows will suspend from time to time. And so this will connect to that list, loop through all the items in that list, and look for any where the status is suspended. And if it finds any, it keeps track of them and then outputs the ID of the item. So it gets to the end. If suspend count equals 0, then everything's good, no issues. If it's not, then status is attention needed, and it outputs all the IDs where it's suspended. So that's been really cool because since we've had this in place, I've been able to find those before the end users start calling me and wonder why their workflow is suspended. I can address it quickly. Here's another real-world use case that this one has been really handy too. This one loops through all site collections in the web app, and it compares their current storage size with the quota that's been assigned to them. and I set a tolerance of 1,000 megabytes. So if it gets within 1,000 megabytes of the warn, whatever the warn level is, it's going to output that site collection. And since we've had this has happened to me a dozen times where I just look at this one list view once a day and see, oh, well, that site collection needs a little bit more storage, so I can go throw some storage at it before the site owner even knows that it's an issue. So it's really sort of, like at the very beginning when we were talking about DevOps, we were talking about shortening and amplifying feedback loops. This is the kind of stuff that we're doing to shorten and amplify feedback loops for all these sites that we're trying to monitor. So this is really cheesy and not very sexy, but it's real world. This is output from that SharePoint list. So I can see, in this case, there were 64 requests in that workflow list, and none of them have any issues, and none of my site collections are anywhere near their storage quota. So at a glance, I just looked at 64 requests and made sure they were all good. So we've got, this thing gets pretty big now, but I can literally monitor hundreds of thousands of things all at once without having to necessarily pay attention. All right. Complex migrations. We're getting close to the end, guys. All right, so we've had these cases where I'm trying to migrate a site, and I have a choice column that has a value in it that's no longer a choice, and so it'll break the migration. So this script will go through and set the choice columns to allow fill-in choices and make them not required. So then I can move all of it over, and then I can reset it back on the other side, but at least it lets me copy. So this just literally loops through and looks at all the choice columns. We've also had these cases where a site will have references to features that don't exist on the destination side. So if you know what those GUIDs are and you get these out of ULS logs, sometimes you'll get specific error messages. You could go through and just have the site remove all the references to those GUIDs. Done this a few times. So this was a fun one. So we have a workflow, and there's a workflow history list, and you can go into a list item and open up the workflow and look at the history of that workflow. This will take that workflow history and put it into an actual list. So we loop through every item, loop through every workflow, and then create items in an archive list, and then put all the workflow history data into just a normal SharePoint list. That's actually been really successful.
So, quick question.
Yeah?
So this is something that I'm currently wrestling with.
This topic?
Exactly this. 2007 decommissioning time.
Mm-hmm.
We're a little bit past that. This is one of the issues. Would that work in 2007?
It works, I'm 100% sure in 2010. I don't know about 2007. I actually don't have a lot of workflow experience in 2007. But we had a similar case. So it's a 2010 site. We're migrating to 2013. And the workflow history doesn't come as part of the migration.
Right.
But in our case, they actually had many hundreds of different sites and libraries, and they wanted to consolidate all that history into one list. So I want to know the original library and site that it came from, the user, and all the outcome stuff. And one thing that we found with this is there's a particular time frame. I think it's 90 days where the workflow history falls off of the UI.
Right.
Doesn't fall off of this. This went all the way back many years. It just stays in there somewhere. So this actually was able to pull out all of the history, even history that didn't show up on the UI. Here's one where we're copying files and folders between libraries. So I'm looping through all the items in a library and then copying to a different library. So this is bringing over the file itself. The file is a separate object from the item. The item is what has all the column data, and then file is actually a separate part of it. So there's a function here that I'm using where the destination folder equals, and I'm calling this function get or create archive folder. I'm going to show you that function. So this literally will connect to the library, look to see if that folder exists. If it doesn't exist, it creates it, and then it will return a reference to the folder. So I'll flip back again. Destination folder equals a call to that folder and just give it the relative URL that I'm copying from. So whatever the folder is that it's in now, just make sure it's on the other side.
Question, when
Sure.
you're copying items, will it bring over versions and permissions?
So in this case, no. I just wanted the file and all the metadata. But you can loop through version history in PowerShell as well. So if you wanted to, we use ShareGate if we want to get all of it. That's how we would do
Use
it.
ShareGate too, but it can be painfully slow with SharePoint Online.
It can be. In this case, we're changing the structure, and that was and I had a whole bunch of libraries that were being put into one library.
Yeah.
So that was the reason I wrote the script instead of ShareGate. If it was just a straight copy from one to another, I'd just hit ShareGate and let it copy and go home.
Okay.
But if you got to change it on the fly as it goes, you could do it this way. Question?
Have you like had a chance to like copy a discussion list?
A discussion list.
Where you have to
Um,
item this or
So again, if it's one-to-one, you're just going source to destination. I would use ShareGate for that. And I don't know if everyone's used ShareGate before. It's a migration tool. Also has a PowerShell interface, so you can actually call a ShareGate module from PowerShell. So if you were doing a straight copy, you could say copy it, use the ShareGate module, and it'll just go. And that's going to get all the permissions, all the history, all that as well. It'll copy workflows too. I haven't figured out a way to copy workflows in PowerShell. All right. Okay, so that was actually the last of these slides. There was just this one last little bit. We're right at the top of the hour, so that's good. So secret wisdom. There's two things I'm going to share with you. The first one is everybody just searches the web and tweaks what they find. There's no shame. There's no shame. Just wanted to put that out there. That's what everybody does.
Tested well.
I tell my users I'm not smarter than them, I'm just better at Google.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. A real SharePoint admin's good at Google. And then here's the real nugget that I'm going to leave you with. You can get the slide deck to get this URL if you don't want to remember it. Joseph Rogers is a Microsoft PFE and just legendary. And every time he writes a new script that he needs for something or other, he's got a blog he just dumps it to share it with all the rest of the PFEs at Microsoft. But it's public facing. His whole library going back to 2005 is online.
Oh, wow.
The whole thing.
Go copy it.
Yeah. Download it before it goes away.
Hey Bob, will you go back to your slide that you have your email address on it?
Oh, sure.
Spam you?
Yeah.
This could be one of us.
Oh, I blew myself up. Here we go. Let's see. Right here. Yeah, and do me a favor and just put peacebug : in the subject, and that way I just, because I tend to, if I don't know who it is and it's not in something I recognize, I just delete. That's just kind of my daily thing. So if I see that in the subject, I'll read it.
Could you have a PowerShell script that detects that and sends us the?
That's a good idea. You can probably just do an Outlook rule, but there's got to be a PowerShell way to do that.
I'm sure you could PowerShell it on the Exchange server.
Probably. That's not a bad idea. David.
Do you have a script or know of a script that when you're attempting to move a site collection off of content database, and let's say it's fairly large, and you want to monitor its progress as far as it's moving through the copying process? Because sometimes it could go hours upon hours and you have no idea.
So that's a good scenario, and I don't have one I can show now, but I almost did that. So it's a different scenario, but the point is that I'm waiting for something.
Yeah.
So there's this concept of a do loop. So I'm going to do until in a loop, and so I'll say this equals that, or copy this to that, and then I have a do loop that runs that's just just constantly looking at the destination, and I'm checking to see if it's, you know, if it's all there, like if items.count is greater than whatever, or something. Something I can look at, and then if it's not the case, just keep looping. And then every time I loop, I'll just like write another period to the screen or something like that, just so you can see progress. Or output, like if you're copying a list or something, you can say I'm on 1,000 of 2,000, and just keep outputting in a loop.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great presentation.
Just so you know,